Hello. Good evening, friends. This is Renu Baid from IIFL Institutional Equities. Today, I'm here to discuss with you on the topic: Can India do away with imports from China? I cover engineering and capital goods sector and light consumer electrical stocks at IIFL. So let me start with a brief introduction on the topic. When we today look at China, both in the buckets for consumer electricals as well as for cap goods sector. So when we broadly look at China today, the imports coming in the cap goods space are relatively more limited to the extent of equipment supplies and components. Probably 5 years from today, if we go back in the past, there was a time when India was importing significant portions of the power equipment, T&D space, and other imports of equipment coming in from China. But because of a localization approach which India had picked up and a phased manufacturing program across most of the end markets and industries, the actual import of of the equipments have come down. And today the imports are largely restricted to components and material supplies. Within the subsector, if we look largely, India's dependence on Chinese imports are skewed towards renewables. And this is where we see significant impact coming in to India achieve India's large targets. We see bulk of the imports of the Chinese components coming in from China for India's renewable supplies coming in from China, and these are largely supplies coming in from solar equipments and projects. This is probably a space where India will be required to do a lot of work to bring down the cost and develop a localized supply base here in India. Versus when we look at the conventional power, India is broadly self-reliant today. We have sufficient manufacturing capacities for thermal as well as for hydro equipment space in India. Even for emission norm requirement, when it comes to FGDs, the imports which companies like GE, BHEL are doing today is predominantly linked to the special components which are not available in India. And this has been a fairly few market. So the extent of imports is just about 10 to 15%. But in rest of the other categories, I would like to say India's dependence on Chinese imports is significantly lower. But the entire philosophy of looking at China plus one for the global markets could actually open up significant large international market for India. And I think that is where the opportunity lies. A lot of companies which are present in India with international bases and the supply chain could actually spur the entire new chain of starting exports from India. We have entities, global MNCs present in India, be it ABB, Siemens, GE, their subsidiaries are present. So they have global relationships. And for them, it would be relatively much quicker to start exports to the international markets. At the same time, when we look at some of the consumer electrical space, how are they stacked up in terms of dependence on China? I would say most of the electrical appliances on the light goods side are predominantly made or manufactured in India. For a lot of appliances, yes, there were imports coming in from China, but this again was limited to trading activities. Not that we are dependent on China, but it was more from the perspective of continuously adding new SKUs in the Indian market. Now the entire pandemic has actually put across a thinking process in the system that why do we need to really rely on imports coming in from China. To some extent, India has the know-how. Companies are spending today on R&D and supply basis, and that can really help them in terms of spending the basis and improving their competitiveness in India. So I think the entire chain of starting an innovation-led process in the domestic market has already been at the start, and I think to some extent one can see this accelerating in the coming days ahead. So the appliances segment, which had seen significant imports, will see some kind of contraction in the days to come. Companies are spending for domestic manufacturing bases, be it companies like Havells, V-Guard, or Crompton for that matter. In the white goods space, yes, there is to some extent imports which still continue. For example, for air conditioners, where at probably 2 years back, if we see the imports coming for the SKUs were nearly 45-50%. But in the last 2 years, many companies have increased their domestic manufacturing capacity. At the same time, they have started sourcing more from domestic market, and this has been driven by a focused policy approach which has been driven by the government of India, through increasing the tariff barriers and increasing import duty. At the same time, companies realizing that there is significantly higher uncertainty when it comes to importing from China, especially for seasonal products. So in categories like air conditioners, today the import has significantly come down, and domestic OEM companies like Amber Enterprises have scaled up in terms of domestic supplies. Even brands like Havels or Daikin, for that matter, have established their own domestic in-house manufacturing bases. Even many international companies who were there in the space, like Mighty, who is the brand for Carrier in India, they also have set up their domestic manufacturing factory for air conditioners. So probably it's a matter of time in the next couple of years that the import of some of these white goods will also substantially come down. But the dependence would still somehow will remain on certain critical components like compressors, where though we have some local manufacturers, predominantly the imports continue to remain heavy. And this is the space where we will see over the next 2 to 3 years some of the global plants establishing the manufacturing bases in India and expanding the domestic presence to meet the domestic market requirement. Even in other electrical categories like smart LED televisions or mobile phones or LED bulbs, we have seen domestic manufacturers come a long way, and they have started assembly operations and started doing a lot of value add activities. Today, in the LED bulb space, we see import dependence has become almost negligible, and companies like Dixon Technologies has emerged as one of the largest manufacturers and the low cost competitive player in this space. Nearly 50% of the requirement is supplied from the domestic plants. Even in the case of LED televisions, where brands like Xiaomi have flooded the market with extremely price competitive product. But the point to be noted is these products are not actually imported from China. They are manufactured and assembled here in India. Some of the critical components, like the screen, some of the LED cells, are imported from China, but the rest of the product is actually assembled and value added in India. So we have built up design capabilities and scale. Probably in the next 2 to 4 years, with a favorable and a supportive government policy action, we could probably see more manufacturing and value addition to come in the Indian domestic market. And I think this is where we could see a meaningful shift in the import pattern on the electrical side. And this is also the space where government has actually helped to drive higher localization and import substitution. First, by increasing the import duties on various components, be it LED products, LED televisions, or for that matter even air conditioner products or components, but also not restricted to just tariff based duty support. What the government is also coming up with is a very comprehensive electronic manufacturing program, whereby they are targeting to start localizing and in-house manufacturing of large durables like mobile phones in India. Now, yes, as a product, it's an extremely tech-savvy product where one would say the technology innovations are driven by the West and supply chain efficiencies are driven by the Far East Asian countries. But yes, given that the government is proposing pretty attractive incentive schemes of 4 to 6% for domestic manufacturing, we will see both the high value mobile phones as well as the low cost competitive smartphones, which are ranging between 10 to 12,000 or 15,000. They will also be manufactured in India. Initially the imports will be high, but we expect that over 4 to 5 years, as the supply chain gets established in India and more domestic international players enter, the space will become far more competitive and India should develop capabilities. And this is the one segment where we believe there'll be a lot of FDI coming in the country. We have seen recently Foxconn announcing almost $1 billion of capex for the Apple iPhone and the other range of products. Even domestic companies like Dixon Technologies, which is present across the spectrum of products, is targeting to enter the space under the PLI scheme for domestic manufacturing of mobile phones. So I think to on a broad spectrum, if we see, the dependence on China has been relatively lower and reduced in the last 5 to 7 years, and the intensity where it is still high is in the consumer electricals or electronic space, where it is still where the segment accounts for nearly 20% of imports coming from China. This is a segment where the government is taking dedicated efforts and policies, and we should expect that in the next 3 to 4 years, A, the dependence on China, direct imports from China will come down, and B, there is an opportunity for India to actually scale up as an alternate supply base complementing China under the China plus one strategy, which many international manufacturers are looking out for. So, on the whole, if we see on the cap goods side, we believe companies like Cummins India could benefit significantly because of the reducing dependence from China and be a key beneficiary of the China plus one strategy. At the same time, there would be companies on the abrasive or consumable side, like Grindwell Norton, which could see a reduction in the competitive intensity from China imports coming in from China, as well as companies like 3M, which has been there in the space for long, but still the Indian capex has not been pretty steady. One could see them significantly scaling up domestic investments and capex and reducing the supply chain dependence that they have on some of the other international markets. But I would say the big difference or the shift would be seen in the consumer electricals and durable side of the market, where in the light electrical side, we have already seen companies like VGuard, Bajaj Electricals, Havells, Crompton, all of them starting to localize their manufacturing bases or supply chain sources from India. But in the white goods, where still the dependence has been there on China, both for components as well as for finished products, I think this is a space where Indian supply chain will scale up, and the key beneficiaries of the shift, even partial shift of imports to domestic local sourcing, would be seen for companies like Dixon Technologies and Amber Enterprises, who are essentially today two key OEM companies present in India who are doing contract manufacturing of these electronic goods and products for various brands, domestic as well as multinational brands in India. So there is a significant re-rating as well as an opportunity for these businesses to easily double the business in the next couple of years. And to that extent, we think for the rest of the brands which are present directly in India, there is a scope for them to improve their price competitiveness through local domestic manufacturing or sourcing from domestic brands. So within the consumer electricals or durable space, the two key stocks which we think will are a clear significant beneficiary of this are Amba Enterprises and Dixon Technologies. And within the brand side, the companies which we like, I think from a long-term perspective, Havells looks pretty good now that they're investing and establishing their entire manufacturing base of air conditioner and the rest of the white goods space in India. But when we compare from a valuations and growth perspective, we like Crompton Consumer as a quality name. They have consistently delivered on growth. At the same time, kept the profitability and the margins intact. The incremental ROEs has been in excess of 20% for the last 2 to 3 years. And this is where we believe they should continue to create value for shareholders and investors in this space. So, with these broad words and opening remarks, I would request the participants to add up their questions and answers, and thereafter we can take the discussion forward. And just a kind reminder that the topic of this import dependence on China is related to capital goods and the light consumer electrical space. So, if we can have questions related to this sector in the background of this topic, it would be appreciated. We'll just wait for a couple of minutes for the question queue to assemble. So I have a couple of questions here with us. First, let me take the question of Mr. Kernadu, who was asked that can India be self-reliant? And if yes, illustrate in detail. So as I mentioned, say for example, let me pick up the example of air conditioners in India. So air conditioners, especially the room AC segment, India used to import nearly 50% of the room air conditioners in India. But if we see in the last 3 to 4 years, there has been substantial investments, A, by brands themselves to set up the local domestic manufacturing factories in India. So Havells has set up a fresh new greenfield manufacturing base in Neemrana, which is probably Asia's most automatic and robotic manufacturing factory in India. Similarly, Japanese players like Daikin, who have been present in India for last few years, they have recently doubled their manufacturing capacity in India for air conditioners. This is not just for the domestic market, but also for the international market. Another leading company, Maidi, which is the top three player in China in terms of the air conditioner, they have expanded and set up a recently large manufacturing base capacity in India. So the manufacturing capacities have already been now set up in India for a product like air conditioner, and hence the result of which is clearly when we look at the market today and the prices which show us fair amount of price competition, discounting, and intensive pricing amongst peers is a resultant of the domestic manufacturing that we're seeing, because companies have far more flexibility in terms of the cost structures, and they're able to offer a much better price to the domestic market. At the same time, even for components, whether it could be for components like heat exchangers or other electrical component, companies like Amber Enterprises have come up reasonably well. And today, even if one looks today as a company, today they are the largest supplier of components for brand like LG Electronics in India. The biggest customer is LG, who technically manufactures everything in house, but still sources a significant amount of the components from Amber. So what we have seen is a combination of the air conditioners, the reduction in the air conditioner import directly coming in from China, and also there have been many SKUs where the Chinese cost structures were not as competitive. So these SKUs, for example, the point 0.8 ton air conditioner, Indian companies have now set up manufacturing bases in India, and that is one of the category where today there is not much of imports coming in from China. So to that extent, I would say we have broadly become reliant, self-reliant across most of the categories. But yes, compressor, which is the heart of the air conditioner, today is still import dependent because it's a complicated product and requires significant capital deployment. Some of the multinational brands like Highly and GMM are expanding capacities in India, but to that extent, I think the heart of the product, at least in the near term, will still somewhere be dependent on Chinese imports coming in. And if we draw down a similar example in the mobile phone segment, where for a product like feature phone, almost everything is done in India today, except for the mobile glass, the screens which are imported, and certain components coming on the battery side. And if we see the government of India's the entire program of localization and production link incentives, if we're able to attract significant capex, then I think it would be very much viable to say that even companies like Foxconn, Winstron, and some of the brands will get the supply chain also in India to have a fully backward integrated and integrated chain in India. So thereby reducing the dependence that we have seen coming in from China and other players. So I would say it is playing out if we have supportive policies from the government and programs, and we are able to attract FDI. Then to some extent, in a lot of categories, we will become self-reliant. It might not be in the best interest to have it immediately because there are cost implications and inflationary impact. But it is not a very impossible target or a difficult target to look at it from a medium term perspective. I hope that answers your question, Mr. Kernadu. Um, we'll take the next question. The next question is from Mr. Anil Rustagi, and he asks us, how will this impact the Indian economy and which companies would be worst affected when you move out or reduce the dependence on China? So I would say from the Indian economy, definitely it's positive because as we see more domestic manufacturing and sourcing coming to the domestic market, there'll be employment generation, and it will earn better revenue for the domestic market in terms of tax revenues and incentives. And the kind of dependence that we had seen or disruption to supply chain or the entire manufacturing and production supply during the pandemic because of import restrictions and supplies not coming on China, to that extent the dependence of the supply chain will reduce. But the companies which would be worst affected would probably be the companies who today are broadly engaged in trading activities rather than actually bringing much value domestic in the table, who are just broadly importing. So let me give you an example. There have been a lot of companies in the consumer electrical space, many tier 2 smaller brands who have been there in India just indulging into trading activities. So these companies were predominantly importing in bulk from China, marketing in India without much value addition. And what we were getting is a product where there is not much of servicing, though it was cheaper, but it was indirectly dumping of products. At the same time, somewhere what also happened is a think tank in India or the innovation cycle had got impacted. But if we see, as companies, some of the large consumer electrical names, be it companies like VGuard or Havels, as they start sourcing some of these products locally, where they were importing it from China earlier, they will now be spending an equal amount of time and energy on R&D and innovation, trying to understand the change in needs of customers and accordingly designing the product for the requirements of Indian consumers, rather than just going and buying one of the new SKUs which is available there on the shop floor there in China and bringing it to the domestic market. So probably yes, we will see in the next few years some of the more product launches or the categories that will come up will be more designed for the requirement of the Indian customers and consumers here. And I think companies which have been sourcing either directly from supply chain basis here in India or through their own manufacturing capex, both companies should be at equal footing provided the sourcing is coming from the domestic market. And at the same time, there is somewhere this innovation wave which would be driven by requirements for the domestic customers. So companies like Havels have been there in this space, who have a philosophy of typically setting up their own capex and manufacturing plants once they see a product category becoming stabilized or becoming reasonable large in terms of the business segments. And even brands like VGuard, who were until now importing water heaters, they have also now established a domestic manufacturing base for water heaters in the segment. So I think it's a matter of time where we see some of the sourcing will move to the domestic market and will help the companies here to that extent. We can take the next question now. So the next question is from Mr. Devendra M, who has asked us, which sectors or companies will benefit more from restricting imports from China? Where we believe at the moment, if we see more of import bans or restriction coming directly, um, the impact would be more in terms of the supply chain or electrical products. So, for example, if we are seeing on the cap goods side, in case if there is a we cannot ban probably, but if we have increase in import duties on certain components, say for which is coming into emission norms for FGDs, then in that case, today all the companies in India, whether it is BHEL, GE Power, or for that matter L&T and other companies, some of the components which are required for FGDs, or flue gas desulfurization units, are not available in India because the market never existed in India, and the volume and scale is significantly lower. So we will continue to import them from India, but the cost of acquisition will increase because of these restrictions being imposed, which indirectly will have an implication on the cost of compliance for the power projects with the new emission norms, and thus it will have a ripple down effect on the increased cost or tariff of power electricity in India. Similarly, in the space, if we take another example of say even for conventional power projects today, though India is self-reliant, we do not import any boiler, turbine or generator coming in from China directly, as in Chinese companies have been out of the market for the last 7 to 8 years. But India is still importing a lot of special steel and materials coming in from China. Not that we don't have any alternate sources, we could buy it from Japan or Europe, but the cost at which we were getting it from the Chinese market were far more lower and competitive compared to the other developed markets. So this had helped us to bring down the cost of the capex for setting up a new power plant. Now, tomorrow, if India decides and we increase the rate of this duty, then clearly there is an implication in terms of the increase in cost of capex for this projects. And this will have implications on companies like BHEL, who technically are still manufacturing the entire equipment in India, but are sourcing some of the materials and components from China. So, to a good extent, I think it would not be right for a country to have a knee jerk reaction, but probably over a period of time, we can develop some of these alternate sources and buy from some of the other nation. And it is more important for us to reduce the dependence of entire equipment rather than just having the dependence. So importing materials or components is still, I think, a feasible option, provided we are sourcing it from a very competitive supply chain basis, because it indirectly helps us to reduce the cost of capex in India. But at the same time, um, the manufacturing clauses or the sourcing clauses that we have from some of the customers in India have ensured that the Chinese competition hasn't moved out. So let me give you an example of Power Grid here. PGCIL or Power Grid Corporation, who is responsible for setting up inter-regional transmission infrastructure, has in the last few years introduced domestic manufacturing clauses. Because of this, what happened is, until 4 years earlier, where we were having significant share of imports of T&D equipment like transformers or like substation switch gears coming into India, many of these global players like TBA, which is now set up a manufacturing base in Baroda. We have a Korean company by the name Usung. It's a switchgear company. They have set up a manufacturing plant in Pune. Similarly, few more other switchgear Chinese switchgear companies like NHBS or Pingao have now set up their manufacturing bases in India. So I think some of the customers, and these are large PSUs, who based on the government's direction have actually set up a local manufacturing norm and policy in place, which has helped them to increase production and translate this entire import of capital goods to domestic manufacturing and create employment generation opportunities. So when we look at categories like T&D equipment for transformers or switchgears, today we are not seeing competition as imports from China. We are seeing competition in terms of these large MNC foreign companies participating with the domestic companies. And once the companies set up a manufacturing plant in India, they are at equal footing. So when we look at a company like GETND, which is a North-based company, they were facing significant competitive intensity from Chinese players 3 years earlier. But because of domestic manufacturing norms coming in place, today they are at a level playing field to some of the other brands. And hence, I believe that this has helped them from a medium to long-term perspective. We can look for a few more questions here. Okay. There is one question from Mr. Avinash Sangvi, who's asked us what could be the role of BHEL in the entire episode of focus on localization and restricting imports from China. So I would say BHEL has been at the forefront in terms of domestic manufacturing of the power equipment space in India. The unfortunate part for the company and for the sector has been that India as a country has significantly moved their focus away from conventional power plants or your coal or thermal based capacity to renewables. And in renewable, unfortunately, the entire supply chain is priced in such a way that the PV that we import from China are far more cost efficient than what we have locally available in India, or even sourcing it from other companies like Japan. So when we are chasing lower cost of renewable power, somewhere there is reasonable dependence of critical components coming in from China for the project. But for a company like BHEL, I don't believe there is any um, threat of competition in the power equipment space for them. But they can probably look at opportunities which can open up in, say, the railway segment. So in rail, though, we have domestic manufacturing factories from players like Bombardier, from Alstom, and domestic companies like BEML in the metro coaches. But still, we had seen in the recent years the Chinese company CRC getting aggressive with the domestic presence. So I think rail could be one of the space where BHL has capabilities, it has capacities, and with some right technology tie-ups, they can significantly increase the presence and penetration in the market. But if someone believe, we don't think so that BHL would be as big a direct beneficiary because of any ban of power gears coming in from China, because India to a good extent has been self-reliant already on the power equipment space. There has been not a single large utility size project which has gone to Chinese player in the last 7 8 years. So for BHEL, it would be role would be more in terms of targeting new markets where it can expand and diversify its offerings away from the power equipment space and make continue to make its business more relevant along with the changing times. But in the near term, definitely there are challenges for the business because of customer payments and increase in working capital. So to that extent, the drain on the balance sheet of the company would be more related to the sector specific issues that are there in the domestic market, rather than anything to be pulled out from the India or the China import spate here. We'll take a few more other questions. So there is one question from Mr. Sanjay Gajare who's asked us which are the other good small cap companies which one can recommend in this environment. So I would say in the cap good space, we like EPC companies like KC International. We think that's a good quality play. They have an order backlog visibility of almost 1.8 times book. It generates over 20% ROE. And somewhere during this pandemic, where we have seen the capex cycle actually getting impacted, because somewhere the private capex sentiments have got impacted, and customers are unwilling to go ahead with capex at this point of time. But the EPC or construction activities has been one space where the work was among the earliest one to pick up. And KEC has a reasonable balanced presence, 50-50 between India and overseas. And within India, it is broadly spread across the T&D, the rail EPC space. And they are scaling up the presence today in the civil EPC business as well. So probably this is one stock which we like in the small cap space, in the cap good space, and it offers good long-term value and opportunity. The stock is trading today competitively at about 10 to 11 times 1 year forward. This would be an interesting name. Other mid cap name in cap goods on the equipment side, which we prefer, is Cummins India. It's again a high quality name, generating good free cash flow, fundamentally strong business, and domestically the business is not directly inclined to capex driven activities, but related to infra. At the same time, because the business is extremely short cycle in nature, though it was among the early ones to feel the pinch because of slowdown and disruption in business activities because of the pandemic, we believe it would also be among the early ones to see the growth and recovery. And the business mix today is very favorably placed. 25% of the portfolio is driven by sales and services. 25% of the sales is driven by exports, which probably will bottom out by the June quarter. And we should start seeing sequential growth coming in the next few quarters. And of the remaining 50%, nearly 40% of the business is entirely driven by construction, rail activities. And the rest of the business also is attached to the services growth that we see in the domestic data center space, commercial, residential, real estate, hospitality, or in the core construction activities in domestic market. So we think it's a quality name to own. There are good health. They dividend payouts are nearly 75 to 80%. They have very good free cash flow and dividend yield. So this is another stock which can be looked at in the cap good space. The third small cap which one can recommend would be to look at companies which are present in the consumable space. Because in the current environment where there is uncertainty over capex, even if expensive, consumable stocks or companies which supply components which are consumable for the manufacturing industries. For example, companies like Grindwell Norton, which is into abrasives and ceramics, or even Carborundum Universal, which is into similar business, they really don't depend on the capex cycle to pick up for the growth to come. Their growth is dependent on improvement or pickup in the IIP or manufacturing activities in the country. And within the space, we think the MNC partner here, the Grindwell Norton, which is a Saint Gobain group company, is a quality name to play. Healthy ROEs, probably auto cycle has already broadly bottomed out, and the performance plastic business that the company is into has been seeing good, healthy tailwinds. And from a long-term perspective, this should be a good value or a wealth creator for investors. In the consumer electrical side, on the small or the mid cap, one can say, though some of these names have become expensive now after the recent run up, but if one has to look at from a 2 to 4 year perspective, names like Dixon Technologies and Umber Enterprises, which are OEM or EMS companies, they could be a good place. Umber Enterprises is largely a company which is into manufacturing of air conditioner and AC components for almost all brands in India. They can be played as a structural play on the air conditioner penetration in India rather than playing the brands. And at the same time, Dixon Technology would be a company which is present across various segments, uh, as a OEM supplier or a contract outsourced manufacturer for products like LED televisions, washing machines, mobile phones, LED bulbs, and now they are entering into business of medical testing device as well as into security systems and cameras. So that's a good way to play this domestic manufacturing thrust that we are seeing in the recent times through import substitution and government policies. Well, I would say the stock has seen some pretty sharp run up in the recent months. But if we see any weakness, or if one is buying it from a long term perspective for at least 2.5 years, then one can still look at adding this name on dips otherwise. So these are good names to own. And yeah, so let me quickly take a couple of more questions before we close. Um, there is one question which is from Rutika Vasa, who's asked us what more incentives do you think the government could give for companies to set up their manufacturing plants here in India? So I think Rutika, government has already laid out pretty attractive incentive plans. On the manufacturing side, they have reduced the tax for the new manufacturing plants to 15%, which itself makes the return on the projects attractive. Government, for sector specific, they are working on programs. Say in pharma, they have come up with a complete new policy for API and other manufacturing base in India. In electronics and consumer durables, specifically for mobile phones, they have come up with the production link incentive of 4 to 6% of incremental revenues which are being generated um, in India, and these are pretty attractive. So I think some of these incentives which the government is coming up for specific sectors, could be for telecom equipment, electronic manufacturing, pharma, chemicals. These should help companies set up their manufacturing plants in addition to the benefits that the government has announced on the tax side. And eventually, I think companies will look at domestic demand also as one of the factors. I think in a medium term perspective, once the pandemic settles out, we will see the domestic demand bounce back. And India as a base is a pretty attractive destinations for engineering components, automotive components, chemicals, and similar sectors because of a strong domestic demand as well as inbuilt supply chain that we have built up over the last few years, which gives it as a relative competitive advantage versus some of the other peers in the market. I hope that answers your question. Let me take a couple of more quick questions here. Um, So there is one question from Mr. Sailesh who asked if India was so ready to compensate for China import. Was India waiting for Corona or Atmanirbhar? Well, I would say there are always two sides to a coin. Unless a crisis hit you, you will never work towards it with the same focus. Probably India had taken actions over the last 2.5, 3 years to facilitate more domestic manufacturing. It was not from the perspective of eliminating or reducing China imports, but to indirectly encourage people to set up domestic manufacturing plants here in India. But somehow, till the crisis hit you, Indians typically don't tend to really move or shake up. And I think this crisis definitely has been a shakeout movement, and we will see more import substitute activities picking up. So we are not talking of imports going zero from China, but we're talking of a thought process that certain components, certain products which could be manufactured in India because of ease and the cost at which they were available, without a second thought, manufacturers and companies were very comfortable sourcing it from China. And they didn't realize that over years they had significantly increased the dependence of the supply chain on one single country. So I think this crisis will bring that thought that even while you're sourcing, while you might continue to source it from China, somewhere you will be required to now have an alternate point of sourcing as well. Now that alternate point of sourcing could be domestic market India, or it could be some other Southeast Asian country, maybe Indonesia, Vietnam, or other part of the developed world, depending on what type of product it is and what are the cost dynamics which really pan out for the component here. I hope that answers your question. Let me take a couple of more in the paucity of time. So there is a question which says, do you see disruption as far as 3D printing is concerned in manufacturing? From Mr. Rohit Satra. Well, I would say 3D printing definitely has been a big change or innovation in the manufacturing side. Some of the companies, when we take some of the leading names like GE or Siemens, have already started supplying. They have supplied some of the product and the components based on 3D printing methodology, but there are constraints, a in terms of the cost which is involved, and the scale. Can we really, from an India market perspective, one also has to see there's a cost benefit advantage. So for critical components which would take significantly higher lead time and various other mix, probably 3D printing could be an efficient solution there, but not cost efficient. uh, and at the same time, if there are manufacturing products or components which are available in India, and where which can be done at a cost efficient manner, then probably they will continue to be sourced domestically. But yes, one could see that from a long term perspective there'll be a combination of manufacturing and penetration of new technologies like 3D printing will take more time, because of the size scale constraints which are available and the cost attached to it. So I can take one last question. Let me quickly pick one. So there is one question from Mr. Iqbal Sheikh, who mentions, as Chinese products have provided larger employment opportunities to our informal sector. So what will be the overall effect on them? Will such large number of employment opportunities will be provided to them? This I can mention here. See, in consumer electronics, for example, we were importing mobile phones from China or smartphones. Many companies have started doing assembly of mobile phones in India after the government of India increased the import duties on mobile phones and various components. One wouldn't realize, but mobile phones, while some of the components continue to be imported from China, Taiwan, Korea, and the other parts of the market, but it by sheer assembly of these components and finishing the entire product in India, it has been a key employment generator. The companies like Dixon Technologies, they employ 11,000 employees, totally, for all these assembly operations which they do in manufacturing of various electronic products which could have been conveniently imported. In their mobile phone plant for Samsung, they are deploying more than 800 people. Similarly, companies like Foxconn, who have manufacturing bases in India and who are looking to do capex of nearly $1 billion, we believe there would be reasonable large employment would be created for assembly operations and other value add activities which would come. So employment generation does come from a lot of these products, but it needs to be a meaningful employment generation, both in terms of product procurement as well as the kind of value addition that you're doing in house in India. And these items look pretty strong, small, but even products like LED bulbs, their manufacturing lines actually is reasonably high labor intensive. So there is a reasonable amount of labor and employment which is deployed because of local assembly and manufacturing of these components rather than buying it from China. I hope that answers your questions partially. So I'll just take one last question. I think we're running a bit tight on timeline here. Um, so last question is from Mr. Ramesh Raghunathan, who has asked us, what's the topic for long term in the electrical consumer goods space? So I would say from a long term perspective, I think the two names I would pick here. One would be on this growing trend of outsourced manufacturing. I think Dixon Technologies is a name, and a company can do pretty well. They have been able to grow reasonably well in the LED televisions and the LED bulb space, by not only working with the market leaders but also now catering to almost 45 to 50% of the Indian domestic market requirement, and ready to serve the other global markets. And I think this entire wave of localizing the manufacturing base in India, and not just localizing manufacturing base, many new brands are entering the consumer electrical space in India. Not everybody has manufacturing know-how and capabilities, and this is where a company like Dixon has created a space for themselves, where they have been also been able to provide ODM solutions to customers, which are their design based offerings which they give to customers. So I think they have a fairly diversified product business, which is not dependent on only one particular business. It is diversified across 6 7 business segments, and the company has been continuously adding new customers, which has reduced the dependence on any one single customer. They are working with brands like Xiaomi, Samsung, Volt, Beko, Philips, Panasonic, domestic companies like Godrej, Intex, private label brands like Vijay Sales, Reliance, retail that we have. So to that extent, they have been able to consistently grow, at the same time keeping the business model fairly lean, keeping the asset structures light, and ensuring that they are able to generate close to 18-20% plus ROEs. So this could be one stock where, when we talk from a long term perspective, from the next 3 to 4 year perspective, could be a good wealth creator. And in the large cap space, I think consumer electricals, we like Crompton Consumer. It's a good high quality name with significant market leadership in key end markets in which they operate, be it the electrical fan segment or the lighting consumer B2C space. In new appliances category, they have recently increased the focus on appliances categories like air coolers or water heaters, where we are yet to see them strengthening their presence. Plus, this is one name where, even if the core business has been able to generate growth of close to 14-15%, but the earnings growth has been in excess of 20%. And the company has sustainably increased their ROEs. The ROEs today pan at 30-34%, which is reasonably healthy. So overall valuations as well as earnings growth, both the combination provide a good mix for them, and opportunity to create upsides for investors. And as and when we see them entering into new business space or embarking on an inorganic growth opportunity, that could further add to upsides and relating for the stock to that extent. Um, so I would say probably yes, to a good extent. In the paucity of time, we might have to take this as the last question. However, I would still like to thank all the participants for taking the time and joining. In case if there are certain unanswered questions, do feel free us to reach out and write to us on research@ifl.com, or visit us on www.ifl.com. Thanks for watching this webinar. Thank you, everyone.